Chapter 3 Charles the King. I determined to proceed at once to treat of his character, his deeds, and such other facts of his life as are worth telling. Einhard. It might have seemed as though a king as occupied with warfare as Charles would have little time to actually govern the territories under his control. Kingship was still a primitive endeavor in the early Middle Ages, and in many ways Charles was self-taught. Fortunately, he was an extremely able and organized administrator who was just as able to govern as he was able to lead an army, although there's little doubt that his military success contributed to his arsenal of talents. All power came from Charles. His loyal Franks knew that, and the peoples he conquered came to understand this as well. He had to be organized. He'd added more territory to his borders than any of his European contemporaries. The acquisition of land required Charles to develop a bureaucracy which could handle administrative tasks. Although he allowed his conquered regions to maintain their ethnic identity and local laws, authority over the conquered area was delegated to his loyal Franks. He could be trusted to carry out his will, to keep the administration running smoothly. Each year, Charles convened a gathering of his regional representatives at Aachen. Peace, the desired outcome of war, meant that the kingdom could prosper. Trade was, of course, the lifeblood of a nation's economy, even in those primitive times. One of Charles' greatest achievements, one which was and is integral to any country's commercial health, regardless of the era, is its currency. Following the 5th century, after a fall of the Roman Empire, the minting of coins was a haphazard business with no established value of coins, which were individually minted. By abandoning the currency which had been based on gold, Charles showed his pragmatism. Gold was in limited supply and not readily available. The peace treaty which Charles had signed with the Byzantines gave away Venice and Sicily and lost the Franks their trade routes to Africa. By standardizing coinage, the Franks were able to ultimately establish a currency which was designed to support expanded commerce. Both Pepin and his son Charles regulated the amount of silver and of gold that were contained in each coin, which was imprinted with the symbol of the king, so that the integrity of the currency was understood to be guaranteed by the royal authority. The new standard, the livre carolingian, was based upon a pound of silver. The development of a single currency rather than an assortment of coins from each region not only stabilized the economy but also served to simplify trading. Following up his innovations with legal backup, Charles and the Capitular de Villis of 802 established firm rules for the manner in which financial matters were to be recorded. By establishing direct price controls on particular goods, Charles demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the economic structure of the realm. Although Charles had allowed his Jewish subjects to continue to be involved in money lending, the capitulary for the Jews, introduced in 814, was a reaction to the Christian belief that lending money for interest was forbidden by the Bible. Anti-Semitism had been a feature of Europe's social makeup for a long time, but Charles himself was not hostile to the religious group. His personal physician was a Jew, as was his official representative to the Caliphate of Baghdad. Letters exist which show that Charles invited Jews to settle in the kingdom of the Franks because he valued the benefits they brought to the economy. In addition to his economic reforms, Charles also focused on legal concerns. Laws needed some spring cleaning after legal housekeeping had fallen into slovenly ways. When Roman authority was no longer the guarantor of a judicial code, under Charles, while people in the higher social ranks were generally held to a different level of the law and could have their cases tried in the palace court, there was nonetheless judicial standards for the population. The laws overseeing marriage and the divorce were codified. Even in the regions he had conquered, the laws of each area were written down. Interpretation of the law was subject to the whim or knowledge of the counts, the titled heads of the areas, who conducted the court cases in order to administer a decision. To diminish injustice or corruption in these courts, Charles developed the office of the royal commissioner, whose role was to investigate decisions made by the courts. His capitularies were rulings that were universally applicable throughout his realm for the Franks and all other ethnic groups who were part of the Frankish kingdom. His innovations validated the success of his reign. The representative governments showed themselves able to administer their region successfully with long-range planning and unity in working on projects which did not yield immediate results. The aqueducts were rebuilt and silos were stocked with food, providing reliable sources of water to the cities and food in case of famine. Charles' grandfather, Charles Martel, had helped to develop a defined social system which would categorize the demographics of the Middle Ages for centuries to come. Charles took it a giant step further with feudalism, which was based upon ownership of land and a loyalty oath. The oath of fidelity, the landowner would not endanger the king, his heirs, or the royal structure itself. The monarchy that evolved from this system was one in which the king's absolute power influenced, but not limited by the advice of his nobles and the church, established allegiance as a defined entity. With the oath, the subject and his king shared a direct connection. Anyone breaking the loyalty oath was guilty of perjury, with the loss of his right hand the sentence for his crimes. He was also reduced to a state of mortal sin and in violation of the church. Duty to the king enforced by the church strengthened the rising identity of the nation. The peace that came to regions as a result of Charles' authority allowed for the successful evolution of peacetime ventures, including agriculture and trade. Charles, the ultimate multitasker, was as adroit at leading an army of soldiers to conquest territory as he was skilled at leading an army of clerks to defeat bureaucratic chaos. Charles had his empire, now he wanted to enjoy it, but he also wanted his empire to be a center of learning and culture, a bold and perhaps outrageous aim for the backward Europe, which could not hope to match the brilliance and erudition of the ancient world. What learning did exist was the province of the clergy in Western Europe, but their standards displeased Charles, who felt that in order to accurately serve the church, his priests needed to have an accurate understanding of the Holy Scriptures. He also believed that education should not be exclusive, although many of his royal peers were illiterate and saw no reason why they should bother learning to read and write when they had clerks to take care of those tasks. Charles was different. His vast conquests whetted his appetite for learning as he was introduced to the cultures of other countries. Charles himself was able to speak fluently. Latin was the tongue of the elite and the educated, and Charles taught himself the language. He also studied Greek, which he found easier to understand than to speak. Charles had a deep regard for education, and he provided instruction for his children so that they would possess more learning than he had been given as a child. Although Charles could not write with ease, and there's some question as to how well he could read, his reverence for learning sponsored what has been called the Carolingian Renaissance. When art, literature, scholarship, and architecture flourished, his biographer conceded that because he learned to write so late in life, the efforts were a struggle, even though he kept wax tablets under his pillow so that he could practice his letters. He studied grammar from Peter of Pisa. Einhard, the biographer, taught him arithmetic. He would learn rhetoric, logic, and astronomy from the man who was regarded as the greatest scholar in Europe, Alcuin of York. Rebirth of learning was already underway thanks to the efforts of Irish monks. Charles continued the support by funding monks to travel to the conquered regions of his realm to preach and also to teach. By recognizing the superior abilities of Alcuin, Charles was able to give Western Europe the intellectual leader that was needed to deliver the region from the weight of ignorance which kept it backward. Alcuin, who was educated at the cathedral school at York, became a monk teacher and deacon. In 781. After a visit to Rome, he met Charles, who spotted the skills he needed and invited Alcuin to come to his court to oversee educational reform. Alcuin accepted the invitation. Not only did Charles gain a scholar, but he also acquired an astute advisor on matters of education and religion. Charles appointed Alcuin as head of the palace school at Aachen, which had its pupils the sons of noble families and members of the royal court. The schools attracted not only the sons of the Frankish nobility, but also people from other European lands eager to expand their knowledge, including Italians, Spaniards, and the Irish, and the king himself, as Charles also attended classes. Thanks to Alcuin, the intellectual revival, which began with Charles' support, led to the creation of other schools which were attached to monasteries and cathedrals, with scriptoria where books would be copied. Surviving works of classical Latin copied by these scholars provide today's historians with the manuscripts from numerous ancient works. Thanks to Alcuin, the learning acquired by his native Anglo-Saxon origins could be shared with the rest of Western Europe. Recognizing the vital role that the ancient texts played in the role of education, one of Alcuin's activities was to establish a library at the palace school. One of Alcuin's most significant tasks was the correcting and copying of manuscripts to create an orthodox uniformity to biblical sources. He also created a script known as the Carolingian minuscule, which consisted of small calligraphic characters that allowed more letters to be written on a single parchment page. This was an advantage as parchment was costly, but it also had an aesthetic advantage as well, as the earliest printers continued to use the format. The minuscule was sent out from Aachen and later from the scriptorium at St. Martin's Monastery at Tours, where in 795 Alcuin became the abbot. His presence at the monastery turned Tours into a center of advanced learning as scholars from all over Europe sought him out. During this time, while Europe was in the throes of barbarian invasions from enemies such as the Vikings, who often targeted monasteries for plunder and pillage, Alcuin's work helped to build a bulwark of learning so that the scriptures and texts that were copied would be preserved. His influence on the evolution of the European intellect was crucial for the advancement of the European continent. Alcuin's role was not confined to teaching students. He was a liaison to the English royal court and established an exchange of news and information on a regular basis. His correspondence was copied and provided for other learning centers throughout the realm, including the one at Salzburg. Like Charles, he was greatly interested in ecclesiastical reform. He had a knack for clear, evocative writing. In his correspondence with a missionary, he advised him to be a preacher of piety and not an exactor of tithes, so that people would benefit spiritually from his work rather than seeking to provide financial benefits for the church. Like Charlemagne, Alcuin sought the betterment of his fellow man through the integrity of faith.